This is Staying with Power, 35 Years of the NES, a pop-up museum at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo 2018. I wanted to give you guys who weren't at the expo a chance to see the exhibit and talk about how we handled curation decisions and setup. So first of all, I want to mention that this exhibit was an effort put together just about entirely by the Video Game History Foundation, which I am a part of. We worked in conjunction with the Portland Retro Gaming Expo organizers and graphic designers as support, and we were loaned most of the pieces of this collection from a variety of people. Let's start with a walkthrough before I talk more about our process, and I'll explain some Nintendo history along the way. When you walk in, you see these striking wall displays that include every US release for the NES, including unlicensed games, provided by local collector John Hancock. They're angled to the left to naturally push you towards the beginning of the exhibit, where we started pre-Famicom Nintendo history, to give you a little bit of the context that the Famicom and, in turn, the NES grew out of. You probably already know that Nintendo is a very old company, founded in 1889. They began making Hanafuda cards, a type of playing card, as a mom-and-pop type store in Kyoto, Japan. They would become the first Japanese company to make and distribute Western-style playing cards, and eventually began to develop toys as well, and even acquired a license to distribute merchandise featuring Disney characters. So this exhibit included some of their old, non-electronic devices and toys. You'll see the Ultra Hand here. This is the first toy Gunpei Yokoi designed at Nintendo, and one of their first big successful toys. There's also NMB blocks, Nintendo's sort of knockoff Lego toy. We move into their Pong machines, like the TV Game 6, among others, and their first big hit electronic device, the Game & Watch. Game & Watch started putting Nintendo on the map overseas, but Donkey Kong was truly Nintendo's first big pop culture hit. If you don't know the classic arcade game's origins, the short version is that Nintendo of America, then a very small operation based out of Washington, totally misjudged the demand for their game Radar Scope, and were left with a couple thousand unsold arcade machines. Rather than just scrap the machines, a young industrial designer named Shigeru Miyamoto was tasked with trying to create a game they could replace these units with. Inspired by American pop culture hits like King Kong and Popeye, he created a revolutionary game involving a love triangle between an ape, a beautiful lady, and a man. Also, it was really, really fun. Donkey Kong was a hit. In this exhibit, you see some of the toys and merchandise that came out of the Donkey Kong mania in the early 80s, trading cards, figures, etc. You might also notice the Donkey Kong Game & Watch, which introduced the D-pad. One of the most interesting items here is pretty easy to miss. Next to the E-Tone Donkey Kong plush is a prototype plushie of Mario. This would have been the companion piece to the Donkey Kong plush, but it was never released. The Game & Watch proved that Nintendo could make a globally successful consumer electronics device. Donkey Kong proved that they could make a globally successful game, so the next logical step was the Famicom. It's a system designed to bring that Donkey Kong arcade experience home, and it did fairly accurately. The Famicom was released in 1983 and launched the exact same day Sega released their first home console, the SG-1000. The Famicom proved to be a far more powerful and enjoyable system, and it became a household staple, selling almost 20 million units in Japan. This exhibit has a lot of Famicom accessories because they're quite different than the accessories we got in the US. Of course, there's the Famicom disk system, the basic keyboard and data recorder, which would allow you to save the programs you write in BASIC to a cassette tape, and the 3D glasses, which were pretty primitive and only supported a handful of games. This is not a chronological list here, but we wanted to show some of the things that made the Famicom unique. If you look close, we have the very early edition of the Famicom, which had soft, square-shaped buttons on the controller instead of the normal rounded ones. The text on the box is also purple instead of blue. You might also notice that the Famicom game boxes are much smaller than the boxes NES games came in. They're barely larger than the Famicom cartridges themselves. Below the display of hardware, the case contains some pretty interesting artifacts. The golden copy of Golf on the Famicom disk system was a tournament prize for golf high scorers and includes an extra 19th hole in the game. It came in this yellow Discoon case like the one next to it. The golden Famicom cartridge of Punch-Out was also a tournament prize, this time for high scorers in US golf, a similar second competition from later that year. A selection of Famicom game soundtracks was included to help illustrate the beginning of the Famicom's cultural impact in Japan, as people wanted to consume more than just the games themselves. This flyer in the corner here contains a screenshot of an unreleased Famicom game, Donkey Kong Music, kind of a predecessor to Mario Paint, and was meant to be a pretty early release. Unfortunately, this next section here is very easy to overlook, so I wanted to make sure I draw attention to it. Of course, Nintendo wanted to bring the Famicom overseas, but it was the mid-1980s. The US was smack dab in the middle of the game crash, and retailers had lost a lot of money on video games. They wouldn't touch anything video game related with a 10-foot pole. In fact, Nintendo originally was hammering out a deal with Atari that would have given Atari the exclusive rights to distribute the Famicom in the US and other countries. This never went through for a number of reasons, but the game crash certainly played a big part in Atari's willingness to take on such a risk. Anyways, Nintendo knew they had to ease into the market, so rather than try to launch a US Famicom themselves right away, they began with the Versus system. This was an arcade machine that used nearly identical hardware to the Famicom, and provided a way for Nintendo to bring Famicom games to American consumers, although they were usually slightly tweaked from the home versions. The next step was the home market. Again, they could under no circumstances call this thing a video game console, so their first idea was to go full computer. They debuted the Advanced Video System at the 1985 Winter Consumer Electronics Show. It was a Famicom, but made to look more sleek and computer-like with wireless controllers, a keyboard, and other accessories. It didn't fool anyone though, and retailers didn't order any. What we have on display here is a blown-up print of the AVS flyer Nintendo distributed at CES. So Nintendo went back to the drawing board and simplified their system, this time posing it as a toy, a robot toy. They introduced Rob, the robotic operating buddy, and bundled it with every Nintendo Entertainment System. They believed strongly that the Famicom could be just as successful in the US despite the game crash, so they took on a big risk. More accurately, Minoru Arikawa, the CEO of Nintendo of America, took on a big risk, without telling his father-in-law, Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi. Nintendo would set up all the displays and provide all the product at zero risk. Retailers only had to pay Nintendo when units sold. And Rob served as both a mascot and maybe a little bit of a Trojan horse. They weren't trying to get those retailers to sell video game systems, no way. Video games were done for. They were just selling a friendly robot buddy that happened to play games with you. Nintendo geared up their marketing efforts, and the evidence is what you see here. This incredible Rob display is one of 2 surviving point-of-purchase displays from the test market launch, something you might have seen in a place like FAO Schwartz if you were in New York City in 1985. The t-shirt and button in the case here are from the NES launch party Nintendo put on that, well, basically only Nintendo of America's tiny group of employees attended. We also have the print ad that only ran in New York Magazine that year, and Nintendo Game Master Howard Phillips' personal script he used when demonstrating Rob and the NES at shopping malls across New York. The test market was enough of a success to spur Nintendo onward, and they then moved to LA, Chicago, and San Francisco, eventually going countrywide towards the end of 1986. What we show next is the NES taking hold in America. By 1987, the NES was the best-selling toy in the US. Up at the top is a complete collection of the black box style games, which are launched and early NES games. Nintendo hung on to that black box aesthetic for a while, as you can see below in the case, which includes some NES stickers and this incredible 1987 Salesman Bible, which is full of paperwork about promotions stores can run, sales they could offer, and more. It also included this order form, from which a retailer might have tried to order Return of Donkey Kong listed here, which never came out. We've now moved into what we consider the big boom, Nintendo's incredible popularity from 1987 and beyond. Inside of every NES box, there was a postcard you could send back to Nintendo for a free magazine. This was called Fun Club News, which we have displayed here. It's just a little newsletter, but pretty soon they had racked up 3 million addresses from 3 million NES owners, which they used to send the first issue of Nintendo Power. People loved this first issue so much, and they wanted so much more content so bad that subscriptions flooded in, with millions paying to receive a copy of Nintendo Power every month. Nintendo Power essentially functioned as a giant advertisement, but everyone loved it so much that they didn't notice, or they didn't care. Aside from the magazines displayed up here, we also have an original draft of the first Howard and Nestor comic from Nintendo Power, sent over for final revisions before being printed. Below, there's the t-shirt you could order from Fun Club News, thought to be the earliest piece of Super Mario Bros. Merchandise sold in the US. There's an original sketch of Howard and Nestor, and a letterhead from Howard Phillips' desk. There's also an advertisement for an unreleased peripheral here, the Nintendo Knitting Machine. And I should point out the M82 retail demonstration unit, which would allow people to try out games in the stores before purchasing. Nintendo Mania is in full swing. There was a major motion picture, The Wizard, that seemed to be a 100-minute Nintendo ad, so we have the theater poster displayed along with the infamous Power Glove. The glass case here represents the Nintendo World Championships and Nintendo Power Fest competitions, and yes, it contains the item everyone is longing to see, the incredibly valuable Nintendo World Championships cartridge. These events were incredibly well attended and well loved. Fans could not only compete, but also try out games that hadn't come out yet, meet Nintendo gameplay counselors, get cool swag, and more. In this case, we have a controller used at the Nintendo World Championships, a letter to a finalist, ticket stubs, and brochures from the event. We're at cultural phenomenon levels at this point. McDonald's has Nintendo toys in their Happy Meals. You could buy Nintendo coloring books, comic books, stickers, toys, figures, Halloween costumes, birthday party sets, trading cards, lunch bags, pins, and you could even go see the Mario Bros. Twirl around on the ice in the Icecapades broadcast on ABC in 1989. There were several cartoons like the Super Mario Bros. Super Show, the Legend of Zelda animated series, and Captain N, which featured third-party characters like Mega Man as well. In this case here we have a sketch of Pit, or Kid Icarus as he was called in the cartoon, which has a second layer of paper underneath with a different face sketch as they tweaked his final design. It's hard to imagine now with the popularity of Nintendo and plenty of other Japanese companies here in America. But this was the first time a Japanese creation had reached this level of cultural impact. Everyone knew who Mario was. The word Nintendo became synonymous with video games. And it wasn't just Nintendo making their own stuff and selling it. Other companies were making comic books of their own NES game characters. GamePro published a Celebrity Gamers magazine issue where they asked child stars what their favorite games were. Spoiler alert, almost everyone answered Super Mario Bros. And Tetris. Nintendo made the cover of Mad Magazine. There were Topps wacky packages featuring parodied Nintendo products. Parody is a great reflection of pop culture, and so Nintendo was obviously pop culture. And of course, in the case here, you can see some companies jumping on board as unlicensed game creators, some a little bit more tame than others, like Codemasters games that required this odd deck enhancer or unauthorized Nintendo security bypass device. Others, like Hacker International / Phoenician, were a little bit more adult. In this area, we also have a Nintendo test station displayed, which was for retailer use only, along with a retailer guide and training video on VHS. Tons and tons of books were published about Nintendo, which you can look through here, including things like a Parrot's Guide to Nintendo, game novelizations, and unofficial tips and tricks books. As this exhibit was displayed in the US, we did mainly focus on the NES's US impact, at least during its manufacturing life, but we did include a little peek into its overseas impact too. In Korea, Nintendo was licensed and sold under the Hyundai brand as the Comboy due to the sour history between Korea and Japan. These didn't sell well as bootleg clone systems were everywhere, and of course much cheaper, so this variant is incredibly rare. Next to it is a UK exclusive NES bundle featuring the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles. You know, because the UK Broadcasting Corporation deemed the word ninja too violent. Next to it, you'll see some European exclusive NES games, including the last licensed NES game. No, not Wario's Woods, but Lion King, released all the way in 1995. And of course, the top-loading NES, which came out as a bargain system after the Super Nintendo had already been released. The Super Nintendo is out. Nintendo stops making games and stops manufacturing consoles for the NES. You'd think this is where it ends, and this is where Nintendo wants you to believe it ends, but hold on, because the NES didn't die at all. New NES games come out every year. The museum takes a bit of a surprising turn here, because most of what follows at this point would not be considered an artifact in the collector's sense, but bear with me as we go through the next 25 plus years of continued NES history. Nintendo was no longer licensing or producing new games, but across the ocean in countries like China and Brazil, unlicensed NES games were a real industry. Places like these had laws in place that made it difficult or even outright prevented the official Nintendo stuff from being sold, so instead they recreated the hardware and produced Famiclones. This was the dominant system in these countries. Developers made all kinds of games for them. Some ripped off licensed characters, Others attempt to downport or recreate games that were getting popular in other countries like Pokemon and Final Fantasy VII. Sometimes the clones resembled Famicoms, but often they took on other inspirations like the PlayStation or a stuffed dog. I have to point out Z-Dog, a 44-in-1 Famiclone that was made in Taiwan featuring many games that starred Z-Dog himself. Anyways, developers weren't just making games. The NES hardware was lucrative for all kinds of systems like this educational computer that teaches typing skills and language. What we call Famicom on a chip or NES on a chip technology was the de facto cheap toy console or computer, even through the mid to late 90s. By the late 90s, Western countries began to play with the concept of emulating NES games. The first freeware NES emulator, Nesticle, inspired a brand new wave of enthusiastic NES developers. They now had access to tech that allowed them to mod and develop these games. This poster contains title screens of over 350 completed fan translations of non-English Famicom games that came out of this scene. And around this time, several companies were still finding value in their old NES titles, releasing updated versions rather than straight ports onto other systems, like the Mario All-Star Collection for Super Nintendo. As we move from the late 90s to the early 2000s, we start to see a real move towards NES nostalgia. A few companies began to bring back NES games as they were, rather than remaking them. This Konami PC collection is just an NES emulator running a selection of their classic games. The collecting scene begins to take root, with digital press publishing community source collector's guides and the first retro gaming shows starting to appear in Las Vegas. And then the NES as we know it starts to look really different. At just about every Walmart, Target, heck even Office Max, you've probably seen some of these pretty awful looking plug-and-play systems, but they all have one thing in common. They're actually NES systems. This NES on a chip or Famicom on a chip technology is the same cheap, easy kind of thing that China and Brazil had already been doing, but now it was being done more commercially in the United States. But what makes this so fascinating is that the games on these systems, despite being advertised as Atari classics, television classics, whatever, are all classic games recreated and developed for NES hardware. By this point, the hacker community that's been modding NES games since the 90s has matured quite a bit and have learned a lot about the ins and outs of NES development. They start to actually make and manufacture brand new NES games in NES shells to work on their actual NES systems. Garage Kart is considered the first commercial homebrew for the NES, with just 20 in existence. Games like California Raisins and Time Diver Eon Man here are unreleased games that fans put onto cartridges, developed box art, and sold. Tons and tons of new, fan-made NES games have been published on NES cartridges. And while all of this was happening, Nintendo was quietly developing their own NES emulator. It was discussed as a project for the ill-fated Nintendo 64 disk drive, but the first time we saw it in action was with Animal Crossing for the Nintendo 64 in 2001. In the game, there are Famicom furniture items you can find and interact with, which allow you to play original Famicom games emulated right onto your N64. And of course, this was also the case with the GameCube release we saw in 2002, just with NES consoles instead. Nintendo also began releasing all of these NES games on the Game Boy Advance. Nothing fancy, just a single classic NES game per cartridge. We have all of the US releases here in that classic black box style. Up at the top are all the Japanese releases of the same series, but there were many more titles released, as well as these rare official collector's cases to hold them all. NES titles on e-reader cards would also allow you to play games on your Game Boy Advance through the e-reader accessory. So the point here is that there was still very much a market for playing NES games, and not just for niche retro enthusiasts holding onto their old consoles. Plenty of people wanted to be able to play NES games on modern systems, and so it lived on. As we move to the end of this exhibit, we're in the modern age, the last 5 years or so, where we're still seeing a ton of commercial NES games coming out in various ways. Nintendo, of course, put out their NES Classic loaded with ROMs of old NES games played through an emulator. It sold millions of units since it was introduced, which is a pretty incredible testament to just how popular the NES is still today. They've also played with other creative ways to capitalize on the NES's success, with games like NES Remix and Super Mario Maker that aren't just ports of NES games, but are a reflection of the NES's popularity. And of course, it's not just Nintendo on the scene. Capcom reprinted a limited number of copies of Mega Man 2 on actual NES cartridges in nearly identical NES boxes to sell, and released a couple of NES compilations on their own for modern systems. The gold DuckTales cartridge here was part of an extremely limited press kit Capcom sent out to journalists. The 3 Dizzy games here were all previously unreleased titles that their creators, the Oliver twins, found and published officially on NES cartridges. There are also still plenty of plug-and-play systems being produced running on NES hardware. Really, the NES is stronger than it has been in years. It's still a very lucrative system, and that's really what we were trying to express with the end of the exhibit here. This is just the first 35 years of the NES. It's still going. We don't know necessarily when it's going to end or if it will end. Maybe NES games will continue to be a viable format to re-release old games and release new games for a long time. So at this point, you've essentially seen the end of the exhibit. Beyond this, we do have a bunch of stations set up for playing some of the classics, as well as playing unreleased NES games like the NES version of SimCity. On the left side of the exhibit, Terry Diebold was there showing off his Nintendo PlayStation prototype, as he has the past few years, allowing people to see it up close and even play it. Beyond that, there was also a small spillover case near the entrance for attendees who wanted to share their rare items that didn't quite fit with the museum's theme. The exception to this is this NES with a special port on the back, used at the Nintendo World Championships tournaments for perfectly synced play. This simply wouldn't fit in any of our other cases. Now that you've seen the entire museum and heard the story of the NES that we wanted to express, I'll talk a little bit about the process of how it all came together. Preparation for the museum started almost 3 months before the show, when we had our first meeting to discuss the theme. Shortly after 2017's Portland Retro Gaming Expo, we had already decided we would be showcasing John Hancock's complete US NES collection, so we knew we would be building around that. The majority of the ideas were developed by Video Game History Foundation founder Frank Cifaldi, and I was basically in a collaborative role, so I'd try to tweak or challenge the ideas he presented and try to perfect it. I think going into this project we assumed we'd be working with a chronological timeline, but there were other, less linear formats we played around with too. Once we had our, quote, stages of NES history, we tried to find artifacts to fill them. The emulation scene stage was added basically post-planning. Because everything born out of this stage in history is digital, Frank got creative with expressing it, printing an enormous image he created that included over 350 completed fan translation title screens. It was absolutely the right call to make sure this stage of history was highlighted, but it definitely seemed bare to me as we were setting up. There really aren't any artifacts related to it at all, so I struggled to come up with what else we could have really added outside of a monitor cycling through some of the games. Another thing we decided early on was the format of the signage. Inspired by exhibits at the Museum of Pop Culture here in Seattle, we wanted to create a similar slanted feel to the signs that didn't force you to really look away from the objects or crane your neck too much. Because this is sort of a lower budget production here, we had to be kind of scrappy, so Frank's wife Amanda built these out of some foldable black boxes, Velcro, pieces of foam board, and these black craft boards. But honestly, they look really nice. You may also notice all of our displays are made out of wire shelving we assembled. Again, kinda lower budget, but effective in creating a sense of verticality that something like this needs. One issue I've had with a lot of pop-up gaming museums in the past is that everything ends up under glass sitting on a table, meaning you have to be staring down the entire time. We definitely wanted to avoid that and have plenty of stuff at eye level too. Another major thing I want to emphasize with this museum is that we really did not want this to be a collectibles show full of nothing but rare and expensive items. While that's cool to collectors, rare items are only a small part of the story we wanted to tell. A museum is more than its artifacts. A good museum is educational and interesting. That's why you'll see several items that are actually quite common, and tons of prints of photos and ads scattered around through the exhibit, which push the story. The museum opened officially at 10 a.m. on Saturday, October 21st, but we began setup around 10 a.m. Thursday morning. Most of these pieces were carefully packed and transported in a U-Haul from the Bay Area of California all the way to Portland from a variety of collectors who lent them to us. Because we had artifacts donated from a ton of different people, making sure to document them before organizing the museum was imperative. So the first few hours were basically just spent with me photographing each and every item so that we could use the photographs as a checklist at the end when we were repacking. The last piece we unpacked from the U-Haul was this incredible artifact right here. Probably the best thing we had on display. The Rob point-of-sale display from the NES test launch. It was found in a warehouse several years ago and is in incredible condition. The Rob head that sits on top is not the most well-crafted thing. It's really brittle, thin plastic, and the eyes seem to be covered in some kind of metallic-y sticker that's peeling slightly. The display comes apart in pieces, thankfully, which made it easier to transport. After unpacking everything, we spent some time organizing the artifacts into vague sections. Some, like pre-Famicom stuff, was pretty clear, but other things took a little bit more nuance. Many sections of the exhibit simply had way more artifacts than others. Versus system was represented by just 2 artifacts, other than the red tent that we had way off to the side of the exhibit, so it didn't stand out as much as the other parts. Actually, that red tent brings up another change we made. We originally wanted to feature some arcade cabinets in the exhibit, but decided to move them away so that the presentation would look cleaner. Cabinets between or behind the tables interrupted the flow of the exhibit, so instead we went without. The locking cases had to have fabric cut and laid out on the inside, all of the keys labeled when we finished setting them. Much of our time was spent building displays, playing with the arrangement of items, and writing up the accompanying exhibit text. You might notice that the exhibit text is meant to look like in-game screenshots, which was an idea Frank had that I think ended up looking really nice. We had a ton of volunteer help throughout the setup process, but it took all of us until the very last second to truly be ready. Also, there were a few things that were omitted last second for unfortunate reasons. We did mean to have several monitors throughout the exhibit playing NES commercials, showing off homebrew games, among other things. We simply couldn't get the videos to work, and this had to be pulled. Above the Donkey Kong exhibit, we originally had plans to put up an uncut card sheet of the Donkey Kong sticker cards, which would have made for a really nice visual. Unfortunately, it was enormous and in a heavy frame, so it wouldn't stay held up. This ended up working out okay in the end, though, as we simply made more room for early Nintendo history artifacts to be displayed. Of course, there's always lessons to be learned and room for improvement, but overall the museum was received really well. Everyone from both the Portland Retro Gaming Expo and the Video Game History Foundation worked purely on a volunteer basis. We were not paid to set this up, and many expenses came out of pocket, as a way to provide an educational service to the gamers and collectors attending the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. It's one of the many ways we hope to keep the history of video games alive. From all of us at the Video Game History Foundation, I sincerely hope you enjoyed this virtual tour of Staying with Power, 35 years of NES history. To learn more about the Video Game History Foundation and what we do, you can visit the link below. You can also make a tax-deductible donation to the foundation using the second link, or by supporting us on Patreon, patreon.com/gamehistoryorg. Thank you so much for watching.